Bonjour à tous. Aujourd'hui, je vais vous lire un article du New York Times du 29 mars 2025. Opération de la CIA et commando en Ukraine. Pouvons-nous simplement admettre que nous menons cette guerre? Pas de troupes sur le terrain semble être une assurance creuse compte tenu de ce nouveau rapport du New York Times. Donc aujourd'hui, je vais vous lire cet article en 3 parties. Tout d'abord en anglais. La partie 2, c'est parti.
In early June, as they met to wargame Ukraine's counter-offensive, sitting side by side in front of table-type battlefield maps, General Zabrodsky saw that the small blocks marking Ukrainian positions had become blue, a symbolic stroke to strengthen the bond of common purpose. When you defeat Russia, General Donahue told the Ukrainians, we will make you blue for good. It was 3 months since the invasion, and the maps told this story of the war. In the south, the Ukrainians had blocked the Russian advance at the Black Sea shipbuilding center of Mykolaiv. But the Russians controlled Kherson, and a core roughly 25,000 soldiers strong occupied land on the west bank of the Dnipro River. In the east, the Russians had been stopped at Izium. But they held land between there and the border, including the strategically important Oskil River Valley. The Russian strategy had morphed from decapitation, the futile assault on Kiev, to slow strangulation. The Ukrainians needed to go on the offensive. Their top commander, General Zaluzhny, along with the British, favored the most ambitious option, from near Zaporizhia, in the southeast, down toward occupied Melitopol. This maneuver, they believed, would sever the cross-border land route sustaining Russian forces in Crimea. In theory, General Donahue agreed. But according to colleagues, he thought Melitopol was not feasible, given the state of the Ukrainian military and the coalition's limited ability to provide M777s without crippling American readiness. To prove his point in the war games, he took over the part of the Russian commander. Whenever the Ukrainians tried to advance, General Donahue destroyed them with overwhelming combat power. What they ultimately agreed on was a 2-part attack to confuse Russian commanders who, according to American intelligence, believed the Ukrainians had only enough soldiers and equipment for a single offensive. The main effort would be to recapture Kherson and secure the Dnipro's west bank, lest the corps advance on the port of Odessa and be positioned for another attack on Kiev. General Donahue had advocated a co-equal second front in the east, from the Kharkiv region, to reach the Oskil River Valley. But the Ukrainians instead argued for a smaller supporting feint to draw Russian forces east and smooth the way for Kherson. That would come first, around September 4th. The Ukrainians would then begin 2 weeks of artillery strikes to weaken Russian forces in the south. Only then, around September 18th, would they march toward Kherson. And if they still had enough ammunition, they would cross the Dnipro. General Zabrodsky remembers General Donahue saying, if you guys want to get across the river and get to the neck of Crimea, then follow the plan. That was the plan until it wasn't. Mr. Zelensky sometimes spoke directly with regional commanders, and after one such conversation, the Americans were informed that the order of battle had changed. Kherson would come faster, and first, on August 29th. General Donahue told General Zaluzhny that more time was needed to lay the groundwork for Kherson. The switch, he said, put the counter-offensive, and the entire country, in jeopardy. The Americans later learned the backstory. Mr. Zelensky was hoping to attend the mid-September meeting of the United Nations General Assembly. A showing of progress on the battlefield, he and his advisors believed, would bolster his case for additional military support. So they upended the plan at the last minute, a preview of a fundamental disconnect that would increasingly shape the arc of the war. The upshot wasn't what anyone had planned. The Russians responded by moving reinforcements from the east toward Kherson. Now General Zaluzhny realized that the weakened Russian forces in the east might well let the Ukrainians do what General Donahue had advocated, reach the Oskil River Valley. Go, 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 you have them on the ropes, General Donahue told the Ukrainian commander there, General Syrsky, a European official recalled. The Russian forces collapsed even faster than predicted, abandoning their equipment as they fled. The Ukrainian leadership had never expected their forces to reach the Oskil's west bank, and when they did, General Syrsky's standing with the president's sword. In the south, U.S. intelligence now reported that the corps on the Dnipro's west bank was running short on food and ammunition. The Ukrainians wavered, General Donahue pleaded with the field commander, Major General Andrei Kovalchuk, to advance. Soon the American superiors, Generals Cavali and Milley, escalated the matter to Generals Aluzhny. That didn't work either. The British Defence Minister, Ben Wallace, asked General Donahue what he would do if General Kovalchuk were his subordinate. He would have already been fired, General Donahue responded. "I got this," Mr. Wallace said. The British military had considerable clout in Kiev. Unlike the Americans, they had placed small teams of officers in the country after the invasion. Now the defense minister exercised that clout and demanded that the Ukrainians oust the commander. Perhaps no piece of Ukrainian soil was more precious to Mr. Putin than Crimea. As the Ukrainians haltingly advanced on the Dnipro, hoping to cross and advance toward the peninsula, this gave rise to what one Pentagon official called the core tension. To give the Russian president an incentive to negotiate a deal, the official explained, the Ukrainians would have to put pressure on Crimea. To do so, though, could push him to contemplate doing something desperate. The Ukrainians were already exerting pressure on the ground. And the Biden administration had authorized helping the Ukrainians develop, manufacture, and deploy a nascent fleet of maritime drones to attack Russia's Black Sea Fleet. The Americans gave the Ukrainians an early prototype meant to counter a Chinese naval assault on Taiwan. First, the Navy was allowed to share points of interest for Russian warships just beyond Crimea's territorial waters. In October, with leeway to act within Crimea itself, the CIA covertly started supporting drone strikes on the port of Sevastopol. That same month, U.S. intelligence overheard Russia's Ukraine commander, General Sergei Surovikin, talking about indeed doing something desperate, using tactical nuclear weapons to prevent the Ukrainians from crossing the Dnipro and making a beeline to Crimea. Until that moment, U.S. intelligence agencies had estimated the chance of Russia's using nuclear weapons in Ukraine at 5 to 10%. Now, they said, if the Russian lines in the south collapsed, the probability was 50%. That core tension seemed to be coming to a head. In Europe, Generals Cavali and Donahue were begging General Kovalchuk's replacement, Brigadier General Alexander Tarnavsky, to move his brigades forward, route the corps from the Dnipro's west bank and seize its equipment. In Washington, Mr. Biden's top advisors nervously wondered the opposite, if they might need to press the Ukrainians to slow their advance. The moment might have been the Ukrainians' best chance to deal a game-changing blow to the Russians. It might also have been the best chance to ignite a wider war. In the end, in a sort of grand ambiguity, the moment never came. To protect their fleeing forces, Russian commanders left behind small detachments of troops. General Donahue advised General Tarnavsky to destroy or bypass them and focus on the primary objective, the core. But whenever the Ukrainians encountered a detachment, they stopped in their tracks, assuming a larger force lay in wait. General Donahue told him that satellite imagery showed Ukrainian forces blocked by just 1 or 2 Russian tanks, according to Pentagon officials. But unable to see the same satellite images, the Ukrainian commander hesitated, wary of sending his forces forward. To get the Ukrainians moving, Task Force Dragon sent points of interest, and M777 operators destroyed the tanks with Excalibur missiles, time-consuming steps repeated whenever the Ukrainians encountered a Russian detachment. The Ukrainians would still recapture Kherson and clear the Dnipro's west bank. But the offensive halted there. The Ukrainians, short on ammunition, would not cross the Dnipro. They would not, as the Ukrainians had hoped and the Russians feared, advance toward Crimea. And as the Russians escaped across the river, farther into occupied ground, huge machines rent the earth, cleaving long, deep trench lines in their wake. Still the Ukrainians were in a celebratory mood, and on his next Wiesbaden trip, General Zabrodsky presented General Donahue with a combat souvenir, a tactical vest that had belonged to a Russian soldier whose comrades were already marching east to what would become the crucible of 2023, a place called Bakhmut. The planning for 2023 began straight away, at what in hindsight was a moment of irrational exuberance. Ukraine controlled the west banks of the Oskil and Dnipro rivers. Within the coalition, the prevailing wisdom was that the 2023 counter-offensive would be the war's last, the Ukrainians would claim outright triumph, or Mr. Putin would be forced to sue for peace. "We're going to win this whole thing," Mr. Zelensky told the coalition, a senior American official recalled. To accomplish this, General Zabrodsky explained as the partners gathered in Wiesbaden in late autumn, General Zaluzhny was once again insisting that the primary effort be an offensive toward Melitopol, to strangle Russian forces in Crimea, what he believed had been the great, denied opportunity to deal the reeling enemy a knockout blow in 2022. And once again, some American generals were preaching caution. At the Pentagon, officials worried about their ability to supply enough weapons for the counter-offensive. Perhaps the Ukrainians, in their strongest possible position, should consider cutting a deal. When the Joint Chiefs Chairman, General Milley, floated that idea in a speech, many of Ukraine's supporters, including congressional Republicans, then overwhelmingly supportive of the war, cried appeasement. In Wiesbaden, in private conversations with General Zabrodsky and the British, General Donahue pointed to those Russian trenches being dug to defend the south. He pointed, too, to the Ukrainians' halting advance to the Dnipro just weeks before. "They're digging in, guys," he told them. "How are you going to get across this?" What he advocated instead, General Zabrodsky and a European official recalled, was a pause. If the Ukrainians spent the next year, if not longer, building and training new brigades, they would be far better positioned to fight through to Melitopol. The British, for their part, argued that if the Ukrainians were going to go anyway, the coalition needed to help them. They didn't have to be as good as the British and Americans, General Cavalli would say, they just had to be better than the Russians. There would be no pause. General Zabrodsky would tell General Zaluzhny, "Donahue is right." But he would also admit that nobody liked Donahue's recommendations, except me. And besides, General Donahue was a man on the way out. The 18th Airborne's deployment had always been temporary. There would now be a more permanent organization in Wiesbaden, the Security Assistance Group Ukraine, call sign Erebus, the Greek mythological personification of darkness. That autumn day, the planning session and their time together done, General Donahue escorted General Zabrodsky to the Clay Kaserne airfield. There he presented him with an ornamental shield, the 18th Airborne Dragon insignia, encircled by 5 stars. The westernmost represented Wiesbaden, slightly to the east was the Rzeszów airport. The other stars represented Kiev, Kherson, and Kharkiv, for General Zaluzhny and the commanders in the south and east. And beneath the stars, thanks. I asked him, "Why are you thanking me?" General Zabrodsky recalled. "I should say thank you." General Donahue explained that the Ukrainians were the ones fighting and dying, testing American equipment and tactics and sharing lessons learned. "Thanks to you," he said, "we built all these things that we never could have." Shouting through the airfield wind and noise, they went back and forth about who deserved the most thanks. Then they shook hands, and General Zabrodsky disappeared into the idling C-130. The new guy in the room was Lieutenant General Antonio A. Aguto Jr. He was a different kind of commander, with a different kind of mission. General Donahue was a risk-taker. General Aguto had built a reputation as a man of deliberation and master of training and large-scale operations. After the seizure of Crimea in 2014, the Obama administration had expanded its training of the Ukrainians, including at a base in the far west of the country. General Aguto had overseen the program. In Wiesbaden, his number one priority would be preparing new brigades. "You've got to get them ready for the fight," Mr. Austin, the defense secretary, told him. That translated to greater autonomy for the Ukrainians, a rebalancing of the relationship. At first, Wiesbaden had labored to win the Ukrainians' trust. Now the Ukrainians were asking for Wiesbaden's trust. An opportunity soon presented itself. Ukrainian intelligence had detected a makeshift Russian barracks at a school in occupied Makiivka. "Trust us on this," General Zabrodsky told General Aguto. The American did, and the Ukrainian recalled, "We did the full targeting process absolutely independently." Wiesbaden's role would be limited to providing coordinates. In this new phase of the partnership, US and Ukrainian officers would still meet daily to set priorities, which the fusion center turned into points of interest. But Ukrainian commanders now had a freer hand to use HIMARS to strike additional targets, fruit of their own intelligence, if they furthered agreed-upon priorities. "We will step back and watch, and keep an eye on you to make sure that you don't do anything crazy," General Aguto told the Ukrainians. "The whole goal," he added, "is to have you operate on your own at some point in time." Echoing 2022, the war games of January 2023 yielded a two-pronged plan. The secondary offensive, by General Syrsky's forces in the east, would be focused on Bakhmut, where combat had been smoldering for months, with a feint toward the Luhansk region, an area annexed by Mr. Putin in 2022. That maneuver, the thinking went, would tie up Russian forces in the east and smooth the way for the main effort, in the south, the attack on Melitopol, where Russian fortifications were already rotting and collapsing in the winter wet and cold. But problems of a different sort were already gnawing at the new-made plan. General Zaluzhny may have been Ukraine's supreme commander, but his supremacy was increasingly compromised by his competition with General Syrsky. According to Ukrainian officials, the rivalry dated to Mr. Zelensky's decision, in 2021, to elevate General Zaluzhny over his former boss, General Syrsky. The rivalry had intensified after the invasion, as the commanders vied for limited HIMARS batteries. General Syrsky had been born in Russia and served in its army. Until he started working on his Ukrainian, he had generally spoken Russian at meetings. General Zaluzhny sometimes derisively called him that Russian general. The Americans knew General Syrsky was unhappy about being dealt a supporting hand in the counter-offensive. When General Aguto called to make sure he understood the plan, he responded, "I don't agree, but I have my orders." The counter-offensive was to begin on May 1st. The intervening months would be spent training for it. General Syrsky would contribute for battle-hardened brigades, each between 3,000 and 5,000 soldiers, for training in Europe. They would be joined by 4 brigades of new recruits. The general had other plans. In Bakhmut, the Russians were deploying, and losing, vast numbers of soldiers. General Syrsky saw an opportunity to engulf them and ignite discord in their ranks. "Take all new guys for Melitopol," he told General Aguto, according to US officials. And when Mr. Zelensky sided with him, over the objections of both his own supreme commander and the Americans, a key underpinning of the counter-offensive was effectively scuttled. Now the Ukrainians would send just for untested brigades abroad for training. They would prepare 8 more inside Ukraine. Plus, the new recruits were old, mostly in their 40s and 50s. When they arrived in Europe, a senior US official recalled, "All we kept thinking was, this is not great." The Ukrainian draft age was 27. General Kavally, who had been promoted to Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, implored General Zaluzhny to get your 18-year-olds in the game. But the Americans concluded that neither the president nor the general would own such a politically fraught decision. A parallel dynamic was at play on the American side. The previous year, the Russians had unwisely placed command posts, ammunition depots, and logistics centers within 50 miles of the front lines. But new intelligence showed that the Russians had now moved critical installations beyond HIMARS reach. So Generals Kavally and Aguto recommended the next quantum leap, giving the Ukrainians army tactical missile systems, missiles, known as ATACMS, that can travel up to 190 miles, to make it harder for Russian forces in Crimea to help defend Melitopol. ATACMS were a particularly sore subject for the Biden administration. Russia's military chief, General Gerasimov, had indirectly referred to them the previous May when he warned General Milley that anything that flew 190 miles would be breaching a red line. There was also a question of supply. The Pentagon was already warning that it would not have enough ATACMS if America had to fight its own war. The message was blunt: stop asking for ATACMS. Underlying assumptions had been upended. Still, the Americans saw a path to victory, albeit a narrowing one. Key to threading that needle was beginning the counter-offensive on schedule, on May 1st, before the Russians repaired their fortifications and moved more troops to reinforce Melitopol. But the drop-dead date came and went. Some promised deliveries of ammunition and equipment had been delayed, and despite General Aguto's assurances that there was enough to start, the Ukrainians wouldn't commit until they had it all. At one point, frustration rising, General Kavally turned to General Zabrodsky and said, "Misha, I love your country. But if you don't do this, you're going to lose the war." My answer was, I understand what you are saying, Christopher. But please understand me. I'm not the supreme commander. And I'm not the president of Ukraine, General Zabrodsky recalled, adding, probably I needed to cry as much as he did. At the Pentagon, officials were beginning to sense some grave official opening. General Zabrodsky recalled General Milley asking, tell me the truth. Did you change the plan? No, he responded. We did not change the plan, and we are not going to. When he uttered these words, he genuinely believed he was telling the truth. In late May, intelligence showed the Russians rapidly building new brigades. The Ukrainians didn't have everything they wanted, but they had what they thought they needed. They would have to go. General Zaluzhny outlined the final plan at a meeting of the Stavka, a governmental body overseeing military matters. General Tarnavsky would have 12 brigades and the bulk of ammunition for the main assault on Melitopol. The Marine Commandant, Lieutenant General Yuri Sodol, would feint toward Mariupol, the ruined port city taken by the Russians after a withering siege the year before. General Syrsky would lead the supporting effort in the east around Bakhmut, recently lost after months of trench warfare. Then General Syrsky spoke. According to Ukrainian officials, the general said he wanted to break from the plan and execute a full-scale attack to drive the Russians from Bakhmut. He would then advance eastward toward the Luhansk region. He would, of course, need additional men and ammunition. The Americans were not told the meeting's outcome. But then U.S. intelligence observed Ukrainian troops and ammunition moving in directions inconsistent with the agreed-upon plan. Soon after, at a hastily arranged meeting on the Polish border, General Zaluzhny admitted to Generals Kavally and Aguto that the Ukrainians had in fact decided to mount assaults in 3 directions at once. Then General Syrsky spoke. According to Ukrainian officials, the general said he wanted to break from the plan and execute a full-scale attack to drive the Russians from Bakhmut. That's not the plan. General Kavally cried. What had happened, according to Ukrainian officials, was this: after the Stavka meeting, Mr. Zelensky had ordered that the coalition's ammunition be split evenly between General Syrsky and General Tarnavsky. General Syrsky would also get 5 of the newly trained brigades, leaving 7 for the Melitopol fight. It was like watching the demise of the Melitopol offensive even before it was launched, one Ukrainian official remarked. 15 months into the war, it had all come to this tipping point. We should have walked away, said a senior American official. But they would not. These decisions involving life and death, and what territory you value more and what territory you value less, are fundamentally sovereign decisions, a senior Biden administration official explained. All we could do was give them advice. The leader of the Mariupol assault, General Sodol, was an eager consumer of General Aguto's advice. That collaboration produced one of the counteroffensive's biggest successes. After American intelligence identified a weak point in Russian lines, General Sodol's forces, using Wiesbaden's points of interest, recaptured the village of Staromayorsky and nearly 8 square miles of territory. For the Ukrainians, that victory posed a question: might the Mariupol fight be more promising than the one toward Melitopol? But the attack stalled for lack of manpower. The problem was laid out right there on the battlefield map in General Aguto's office. General Syrsky's assault on Bakhmut was starving the Ukrainian army. General Aguto urged him to send brigades and ammunition south for the Melitopol attack. But General Syrsky wouldn't budge, according to US and Ukrainian officials. Nor would he budge when Yevgeny Prigozhin, whose Wagner paramilitaries had helped the Russians capture Bakhmut, rebelled against Mr. Putin's military leadership and sent forces racing toward Moscow. U.S. intelligence assessed that the rebellion could erode Russian morale and cohesion. Intercepts detected Russian commanders surprised that the Ukrainians weren't pushing harder toward tenuously defended Melitopol, a U.S. intelligence official said. But as General Syrsky saw it, the rebellion validated his strategy of sowing division by impaling the Russians in Bakhmut. To send some of his forces south would only undercut it. I was right, Aguto. You were wrong, an American official recalls General Syrsky saying and adding, we're going to get to Luhansk. Mr. Zelensky had framed Bakhmut as the fortress of our morale. In the end, it was a blood-drenched demonstration of the outmanned Ukrainians' predicament. Though counts vary wildly, there is little question that the Russians' casualties, in the tens of thousands, far outstripped the Ukrainians. Yet General Syrsky never did recapture Bakhmut, never did advance toward Luhansk. And while the Russians rebuilt their brigades and soldiered on in the east, the Ukrainians had no such easy source of recruits. Mr. Prigozhin pulled his rebels back before reaching Moscow. 2 months later, he died in a plane crash that American intelligence believed had the hallmarks of a Kremlin-sponsored assassination, which left Melitopol. A primary virtue of the Wiesbaden machine was speed, shrinking the time from point of interest to Ukrainian strike. But that virtue, and with it the Melitopol offensive, was undermined by a fundamental shift in how the Ukrainian commander there used those points of interest. He had substantially less ammunition than he had planned for. Instead of simply firing, he would now first use drones to confirm the intelligence. This corrosive pattern, fueled, too, by caution and a deficit of trust, came to a head when, after weeks of grindingly slow progress across a hellscape of minefields and helicopter fire, Ukrainian forces approached the occupied village of Robotyne. American officials recounted the ensuing battle. The Ukrainians had been pummeling the Russians with artillery. American intelligence indicated they were pulling back. "Take the ground now," General Aguto told General Tarnavsky. But the Ukrainians had spotted a group of Russians on a hilltop. In Wiesbaden, satellite imagery showed what looked like a Russian platoon, between 20 and 50 soldiers, to General Aguto hardly justification to slow the march. General Tarnavsky, though, wouldn't move until the threat was eliminated. So Wiesbaden sent the Russians coordinates and advised him to simultaneously open fire and advance.